Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's 1 o'clock Torah talk. Um, Today we commemorate in Israel Yom Hashoah v'Hagvura, what Memorial Day for the Shoah, the Holocaust, and in Hebrew we call it Yom Hashoah v'Hagvura, which means the day of the Shoah and the day of strength or courage. So, why is it called strength and courage? Once upon a time in the state of Israel, in the young state of Israel, the question was how to deal with the question of the Shoah. And originally they made the day to commemorate the Shoah on the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because they liked the symbolism of the fact that Jews who fought back, because that was the ethos of the young state of Israel at the time, that the Jew has to stand up for their rights in the face of adversity and anti-Semitism. And therefore, the day that was picked to commemorate the Shoah, despite the fact that we're talking about years, the date that was picked was specifically the day of the beginning of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, and in April. And that's what we commemorate today. But I think over the years in Israel, the population has matured and realized that the gvura, the courage, is not just what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. The courage is the survivors themselves, or those who tried to survive. Because it takes a great courage to believe in life and to trek on when everything in front of you is a stumbling block. So every survivor is courageous, not just those who took part in uprisings. And everybody who tried to survive and did not give up on life was also courageous. And these are the things that come to our mind today when we talk about Yom HaShoah v'Gvura. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to tell just 3 stories. And in our tradition, stories are important. We have a parsha in Breshit, which is called Chayei Sarah, and there's a story there about the servant of Abraham, who Abraham sends him to look for a wife for Isaac. And he says, you'll go, and the servant, and the story is told 3 times. And the first time it's when it actually happens, when he goes to the well, and he beseeches God, give me a sign. Maybe the girl who comes to the well and says, I will give you water, and I will give your camels water, she's the one. And then it actually happens. And then he tells the story to Laban of what happened. Basically, you have like 3 times the story by the narrative. And the Talmud says, and so does the Midrash say about this, Gadol sichatan shel avdei avot yoter mitoratan shel banim. Greater is the idle talk of the servants of our patriarchs than even the Torah of the later generations. Because look, the 5 books of Moses records 3 times the story of the servant of Abraham. So obviously it must be important. So I've always said that really our lives are stories. Stories comprised of other stories within the story. But everybody's life is an important story and has many chapters within the story. And therefore everybody's life is something to learn from. And especially from people who were faced with adversity and obstacles and persecution and learned how to persevere and get over it. There's a lot to learn from their lives, and their stories must be told to understand things about life that sometimes we only gain through experience. In Hebrew, there are 2 words for zaken. There's two types of zaken, which means an elderly person. A wise person in Hebrew is called an elderly person because there's a certain type of wisdom that comes with experience and age. And so for this is assumed that even as zaken ashmai, even somebody who was not a scholar, but they've gone through life experiences, that this accumulation is an accumulation of knowledge at the same time. So without further ado, I want to tell three stories. One of them I told last night in honor of our ceremony, but I'd like to tell it here, and I will add two. So the first one is the one I told last night about my dear friend Michael Smas, one of the few survivors today of the Warsaw Ghetto uprisings of 1943, of which he was 15 years old at the time. And just as a little introduction, in order to put this in the right circumstances, so he said that there were only a few hundred people left in the ghetto on April 15th, 1943, when the ghetto was to be liquidated, because everybody had been taken out before. Many met their death in Treblinka, and some by starvation. Out of the hundreds of thousands of people who were in the Warsaw Ghetto, by that time, there were probably only a few hundred left. He said a lot of the ones who had decided to take up this fight were people actually who knew each other from the youth movements in Poland. He himself was in the Shomer Tzair youth movement in the city of Danzig, which was where he was from. And before he had come to, and then I think after in Lodz, and before he had come to the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, he said that the people who were the fighters did not expect to win, obviously. But they wanted to, basically, they wanted to meet their deaths fighting. They wanted to go down fighting. And the amount of pistols that they've accumulated by smuggling and buying and this and that were not very many. I think maybe they had about 80 to 100 pistols. They had created for themselves Molotov cocktails, he said, because some of them had the job of polishing helmets for the army, and the turpentine, the polish that they used to use, some of it they would put aside to create these Molotov cocktails. And they lined themselves up, and they expected on April 15th, when they saw the soldiers coming in, it was Polish and Ukrainian mostly. The Nazis very often would just sit on the outside. So that first day when they saw this group of 20 to 30 Polish and Ukrainian soldiers coming through to gather the people together for liquidation, they were sitting there ready, and they opened fire from various vantage points and houses and porches. Said the soldiers were so shocked that somebody was shooting at them, they just ran off. He said after that, they were very encouraged because they didn't think that they would survive even the first day. He says, of course, the next day, or maybe the day after, the soldiers came back with an armored personnel carrier, what we call in Hebrew a nagmash, an APC. And but what they did was they sent a few people down to go underneath the APC, put the Molotov cocktail, and it ripped off part of the wheel of the APC, so it couldn't contain it again. The soldiers ran off. And then, of course, he also said that during that time, remember it was about a month, the whole rebellion, which is very interesting, by the way, because the Polish army fell to the Germans in 1 month, and the rebellion of the Warsaw Ghetto against the Germans also took a month, and it was just these schoolboys, you might say, fighting with whatever they had, a few hundred of them. He also says that at a certain point, the Red Cross came in, and because the Nazis didn't want everybody to know what was going on, so that was the day they allowed prisoners. And that's the famous photograph of the young boy holding his hands up He says they took the prisoners, but then after that they just sent them to Treblinka. He says then the day after the Red Cross left, they started systematically blowing up house after house after house. If the people came out, they were shot. If not, they were buried underneath these houses, one to another, just to get rid of everybody and to stop the uprising. So now that I've told you a little bit of that information, I'll tell you the story. The story was I brought Mr. Smas to speak to a group. I think it was at the Hebrew University that year in Jerusalem. And as we were driving back to Tel Aviv, he said to me, Rafi, I'm not so observant, but I'm a believing Jew, you know. I said, look, I don't question people. It's not my place. He says, you want to know what my belief is? I said, if you want to tell me, of course, why not? He says, I'll tell you what my belief is. He says, you know, I told you I was 15 years old at the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Um, they made me a sort of runner between the houses to tell information from one side to another. I knew a lot of the people. We were only a few hundred. Many of them I knew personally, many of them I knew who they were. And in that last week, when the Germans went from house to house, blowing up the houses, shooting people, and I was sitting in my little place of um, where I was hiding, every 20 minutes, I would hear a shot, and I would hear somebody say Shema Yisrael and fall to the ground. Every 20 minutes, I would hear this Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, the shot falling to the ground. He says, and this went on for days. And every time I heard that Shema Yisrael, I knew exactly what it meant. He says, that never left me. The nightmares continued with me after the war. And every night when I go to sleep, I can hear that Shema Yisrael. And every morning when I wake up, I can hear that Shema Yisrael. And that is my belief. That's the story. Story number two. Story number two was told to me actually by, I hope he's okay, Professor Norman Lamb. And I know he was ill recently, and I wish him refuah. I wish him speedy recovery. And the story was about Shlomo Zalman Shragai. Shlomo Zalman Shragai was a member of the Mizrahi Party before the state. That was the National Religious Party. And the Jewish, and also a member of the Jewish Agency. And the Jewish Agency, which acted as a sort of shadow cabinet before the establishment of the government of Israel. So they took themselves very seriously and they sent people to Poland as representatives of the Jewish agent and the Jewish people looking for children in who might have been hiding in monasteries during the Shoah, and there were many children of such that the parents gave them over because they knew this was their chance of surviving, especially, by the way, in Krakow. For those who've been to Krakow and saw the area of the ghetto, there were many places. The ghetto in Krakow was not like the ghetto in Warsaw. There were a lot of entrances, and a lot of these entrances were easy to, let's say, pay off the guards to slip something through because they were so close to the outside. Sometimes the Polish people, who were not afraid, sometimes would actually throw food over the ghetto wall because they started realizing what was happening there. It was that close there. And so I had many, many stories of mothers who would bribe guards and send out their babies and have them brought over to monasteries to be saved. In fact, the most famous case probably was the case in France of Cardinal Lustiger, who exactly was a child like that, who his parents, his Jewish parents who had died in the Shoah, had given him over to the Catholic Church, and he was raised that way and actually became a cardinal in France many years later. So children there were, And so he was sent to look for such children. There's a famous story of Rabbi Kahanman, which has become famous by by the singer Yaakov Shwekey's song, that he was told of such a place, and he went to this convent, Rabbi Kahanman from the Panovich Yeshiva, and they didn't want him to talk to the children. There are various versions of this story. One version is they gave him 5 minutes. Another version, they told him that he could only go around when they're eating. And the story, of course, goes that he whispered to each child the Shema Yisrael, and the ones who recognized the Shema Yisrael that their mothers had told them before they went to sleep, they started to cry and say, "Mommy, Mommy." So he knew that those were the Jewish children. And so the story goes, Shlomo Zalman Shragai was sent to Poland by the Jewish Agency in 1946, looking for children that were still being held possibly in monasteries. Some of these children, of course, were given back through consent. Some of them were discovered. Some of them were denied that they were, etc. In fact, there are stories until this day. I remember a colleague of mine in the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, a philosophy professor, who discovered he was Jewish at the age of 40 and didn't actually know that because as a child, he was never given that information. His son today lives in Tel Aviv. So, so the story goes that Shlomo Zalman Shragai is on the train going back. He's leaving Krakow. In those days, the trains went really slowly. Today, you can get a fast train, just a little over 3 hours to Warsaw. Those days, the trains went slowly, took the whole night. He enters a cabin, and in that cabin are sitting elderly gentlemen dressed in sort of a Hasidic type of dress. He knew it because he was familiar with the way they used to dress. And next to him, his daughter. Okay, they're in the cabin, and you don't really know the people are, but he looks out and he sees the sun starting to go down. So he looks at the man, he says, Mincha, it's time to pray the afternoon prayer, Mincha. So the man looks at him and says to him in Yiddish, he says, Mincha? He says, he doesn't deserve it. Not after what happened. Okay, Shlomo Zalman Shragai hears, okay, what's he supposed to do? So he prays the Mincha, and the other guy's just sitting there in the cabin on the chair. Anyhow, the rickety train keeps going, and it gets dark, and Shragai falls asleep. And then, of course, in the summer in Poland, it can get light quite early. And after a couple hours, he opens up his he opens up his eyes, and he sees the fellow across from him putting on tefillin, donning the tefillin, the phylacteries that we put on the arm and on the head in the morning prayer. So he looks at him and says, "Didn't you say something about mincha?" So the man said to him, um, so he says, "What's going on? All of a sudden you're put on tefillin, you're saying shachrit." The man looks at him and he says, "Vemen noch the Ibis Turandot Welt, which means, who else does God have in this world? I'm just taking pity on him." There's a certain courage to have a strong belief even when you are angry. The Jew who is angry against God is also a great believer. The person who is angry against God is also a great believer. It's apathy, which is the real enemy. But love, anger, that's all part of a relationship. In relationships, sometimes you love and sometimes you fear and sometimes you are angry. And that's all part of the relationship. We have to understand that. So that's one of the things that he learned in that train coming back from Krakow. The last story I want to tell is, I think it was 2007. It was I think the second time I had brought a group to Poland. of young people. I think that particular group was mostly Russian speakers who, for them, the Shoah is a very important part of their Jewish education. And we were on a flight, an El Al flight, and I was sitting next to an elderly gentleman. Okay, so it's always like nice to make conversation at 35,000 feet. I said hello. He said hello. Where are you from? I'm living in Israel. I said, have you ever been to Poland before? He looks at me and says, yes, but it was a long time ago. I said, okay. Anyhow, I had a book. He had the newspaper. He went to his newspaper. I went to my book. So I'm reading the book for a while, puts down his newspaper, and turns to me again. He says, I was in Birkenau. So I looked at him and said, oh, I didn't really know what to say. So I just sat there for a moment. He went back to his newspaper, and I went back to my book. About 5 minutes later, he puts down his newspaper again. He looks at me and says, I don't believe in God. I said, okay. I didn't really know what to say, so he went back to his newspaper, and I went back to my book. 5 minutes later, he puts down his newspaper again. He looks at me and says, you want to know why? I said, okay, why? He says, look, he puts his name paper on the desk, a little tray. He says, I was in Birkenau for over 6 months. My job, we were working right near the crematoria. Between the crematoria and the gas chambers, we had to collect the bodies and bring it over to the people, launched it into the crematoria. Every time they brought in people into those chambers, I could hear them. And I swear to you, I heard rabbis screaming out that there is no God, that there's no Din and no Dayan, no judge and no judgment. So if rabbis were saying that, what do you expect from me? What do you expect from me? I could see the pain in his eyes. I looked at him. He looked at me. He went back to his newspaper, and I went back to my book. There's a certain belief through pain, just like there's a love through pain. Because in the end of the day, belief in God is not belief that, it's a relationship. It's belief in. And in this relationship, we wonder why we go through difficult times sometimes. And it's the hope that gets us through, like in every relationship, the belief in the relationship, which gets us through the difficult times. I will end by one last story. I was in Krakow, also 2007, 2008, and I met an elderly gentleman there who was a survivor, and he wanted to come back. He says the first time that he actually made the attempt to come back to Poland. And he wanted to meet young people there to tell him the story. He didn't know there weren't so many in Krakow at the time, but there was a small group. Those who knew, it was called the Cholon group because they're a mixture, a hodgepodge of people. And they decided to have an event with this gentleman. He was going to show a little video that he had made, and at the same time, he was going to talk to people. So I was there, wasn't that many people, and he said to me, when the day that I walked into Auschwitz, I knew I was going to come out. He said, how did you know? He says, I'll tell you how I knew. I was really scared. I was standing there in the line. I didn't know which line they had put me in. Somebody in front of me got stamped, and the one who stamps you was, of course, another Jewish inmate. And then it came to me, and the guy picked up the stamp and was about to put it on my arm, and he says, before I do this, I want to tell you, you're going to live. And I looked at him, I said, are you a prophet? I mean, how do you know? I mean, what awaits us? Says, I know it awaits you, but you're going to live, and I'll tell you why. I'm about to stamp you, and I just figured out that the sum total of the numbers that you're going to see on your arm comes out to 18. In our tradition, 18 is the Hebrew word chai, which means life. So I know you're going to live. He says, I don't know who that man was, but he gave me so much hope, and he was right at the end of the day. So if there's something to take away with us, to inspire us from Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, it is the determination, the hope, the belief of the ability to survive the worst types of persecution and darkness that mankind can produce. Because if we have that faith and we have that capability and we know how to use it in our lives, there is a chance that the future of the human race will actually be good. Shalom, shalom.